What if one of the most famous stories in human history, I'm talking about a story that has shaped the lives of billions, didn't actually happen the way we've always been told? Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving into a narrative of literally epic proportions. We're talking about a massive nation of slaves, mind-bending miracles, a dramatic escape through a harsh desert, and 40 years of wandering. For thousands of years, the story of the Exodus has profoundly shaped faith, identity, and history. But as we dig deeper into the sands of time, modern archaeology has essentially forced us to confront a very uncomfortable but deeply fascinating question.
So here's the big question. Where is the evidence? If millions of people packed up, left Egypt, survived the impossible, and wandered the desert for 4 decades, why is the physical proof just missing? It's honestly a fascinating historical mystery. According to the traditional narrative, an entire population left Egypt in a single sweeping event. They crossed into the wilderness, survived for decades, and built their identity, their laws, and their entire culture right there in the desert. It's arguably one of the most powerful origin stories ever written. But here's where the problem really begins. If that many people truly lived in the desert for that long, something should remain, right? Just anything.
Let's put this into perspective and contrast the two totally different realities of this mystery. On one hand, you have the biblical scale. This describes hundreds of thousands, maybe even millions, of people moving in one massive single migration. On the other hand, you have the archaeological footprint, which is just an empty desert. It remains almost entirely silent. There's this staggering disconnect between the massive size of the story we all know and the stark emptiness that archaeologists actually see on the ground today.
And that brings us to our investigation of the Sinai Peninsula and what experts call the silence of the desert. Now, I want to be clear here. This silence is not for a lack of trying. Archaeologists haven't just casually looked around a few sand dunes. They have spent decades systematically searching this region. They've mapped ancient migration paths, they've scoured the routes, and they've painstakingly examined soil layers, campsites, artifacts, and burial patterns. They know exactly what to look for because mass human migration, it is absolutely not invisible.
Because here's the thing about us humans. We are inevitably messy. We just are. Imagine a massive music festival, right? But one that lasts for decades. When we move, we leave a massive trail behind us. We drop pottery fragments, we discard broken tools, we build fire pits for warmth and cooking, and sadly, we leave behind graves. We also leave unmistakable signs of repeated settlement. Archaeologists know exactly how to find these traces. Yet despite systematically searching for these exact clues across the Sinai for decades, researchers are met with a really profound lack of material.
There are no large encampments out there. There's no evidence of millions of travelers. There is no archaeological footprint that matches the biblical scale. Just emptiness. It's an eerie, persistent silence in the physical evidence. And that silence forces us to ask a really fundamental investigative question. If a massive migration of millions of people actually happened, where did everyone go? How could they just vanish without a trace?
To really wrap our heads around the scope of this mystery, we can't just look at the desert. We have to cross-examine ancient Egypt. And ancient Egypt wasn't some obscure, forgotten civilization. Not at all. It was one of the most meticulously documented societies in the ancient world. They were downright obsessive about record-keeping. They wrote things down. I mean, they literally carved their history into stone.
And this is where the documentary silence becomes genuinely staggering. Look at this comparison. The Egyptians meticulously recorded everything: wars, military campaigns, incredibly complex tax systems, the daily organization of their massive labor forces. Major events were preserved in grand inscriptions for everyone to see. Yet, if an entire enslaved population had suddenly escaped, especially after experiencing nationwide, catastrophic plagues that matched the biblical account, you would absolutely expect a massive disruption. But the Egyptian archives, they have zero mention of it. No mass slave escape, no plagues, no sudden collapse of their labor systems. A disruption of that biblical scale would be highly visible in the historical record, but it's completely missing.
So, the crucial point is how we interpret this. The historical silence is striking, for sure, but historians remain incredibly careful here. As the saying goes, and this is a really profound way to look at it, this lack of Egyptian records is not proof of absence, but absence of confirmation. It doesn't definitively, 100% prove that absolutely nothing happened. What it means is that we simply do not have the corroborating documentation we would naturally expect for an event of such world-altering magnitude.
Which brings us to the next massive archaeological puzzle in our investigation, the 40-year problem.
The story tells us that this massive population didn't just transit through the desert quickly and move on. They lived there for an extended timeline.
40 years. Just pause and think about the sheer length of that time. A single family today leaves behind pounds of debris in just a week. Now take that and multiply it by hundreds of thousands, or even millions of people living in one specific region for 4 decades. They wouldn't just leave a few broken pots behind, they would permanently scar and reshape the entire landscape.
Yet when we look at the exhaustive surveys of the Sinai, we just do not find large, continuous settlement layers. We don't find mass habitation sites or the kind of material culture you'd expect from prolonged occupation by millions. Researchers find only scattered, limited traces of ancient activity, nothing even approaching the scale of a migrating nation. And so the question grows louder. Was the actual scale completely different than what the story described?
This is where we need to shift our focus to the experts, because it's really important to clarify that modern historians and archaeologists don't just throw their hands up and say, well, nothing happened at all. That's just not how historical investigation works. Instead, they lean in and ask a much more nuanced question. What actual historical reality exists beneath this epic story?
Scholars generally lean toward a few leading theories to explain this. First, it might have started with a smaller historical core, meaning maybe small, separate groups left Egypt over time and their escapes were later magnified into a much larger national memory. Or perhaps it served as a symbolic national origin story, taking the universal concepts of oppression and freedom to bind a newly forming people together. It's also highly likely that it's a cultural memory, where different events, different places, and various tribal traditions slowly merged over hundreds of years into one incredibly powerful consolidated narrative.
But regardless of which theory scholars lean toward, we have to summarize the core agreement among most experts today. And the neutral scientific consensus simply boils down to this. There is no archaeological evidence for a mass exodus of the scale described in the biblical text. The physical proof for a sudden massive migration of millions just isn't there in the sand.
Which brings us to a really fascinating pivot. If the evidence isn't there, we have to explore a secondary, equally important mystery. Why does the story still dominate? I mean, despite the complete lack of excavated proof, the story of the Exodus never disappeared. In fact, it only grew stronger over millennia. Why is that?
Well, it's because the Exodus is so much more than just a missing archaeological site. It's a blueprint for human resilience. It is the ultimate story of freedom from slavery. It's about maintaining your identity under brutal oppression. It's about surviving against absolutely impossible odds and holding on to a divine promise of liberation. For millions of people across centuries, the true power of this story doesn't lie in dirt, broken pottery, or excavated artifacts. It lies in a promise of liberation that still resonates today.
So, as we bring our investigation to a close, we are left navigating this ultimate tension. On one side of the scale, we have a story that has shaped civilizations, laws, and human rights for thousands of years. It is an undeniable, massive cultural force. And on the other side, we have the silent, empty reality of the physical desert. A desert that holds no clear evidence of the event as it was described.
And sitting right there smack in the middle of that powerful narrative in that empty desert is a question that simply refuses to go away. Did history happen the way the story tells it, or did the story shape how history is remembered? Because sometimes, in the pursuit of historical truth, the most important question is not just what we find in the ground, but what we fail to find. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll catch you next time.